had this distinct memory from when I was growing up, watching a movie that many of you might have watched before as well, called A Few Good Men. And there's the famous courtroom scene, and I won't subject you to my Jack Nicholson impression because it would be terrible, but he talks about, you can't handle the truth. I don't know why, but for some reason, that movie, that scene, I decided I wanted to become a lawyer. Years later, I did, but then my career takes a slightly different path. And as the strategic threat intelligence lead for PwC, I really get to still look for the truth, but in a slightly different way. I get to look at the who, what, and why behind cyber attacks. And I began my career in the Australian Signals Directorate, where I looked at different kinds of threats, and then had to deal with a lot of different reporting for different types of consumers. And that's sort of where I cut my teeth on doing traditional intelligence analysis.
Alrighty. I was going to go with g'day, but it's kind of a bit too tokenized. But anyway, I'm Jason. I head up our technical threat intelligence team, so the reverse engineers, the threat analysts kind of sit underneath myself. I apologize if I start to go off script. I've got man flu, and if Rachel starts to take me off, it's probably because I'm going to turn into a drop bear of some description. But yeah, so we do a lot of the threat research within PwC. We're responsible for CloudHopper. I apologize if you had to do a lot of work with that one. So yeah, but we're going to talk to you about some quite interesting stuff.
So at last year's summit, there were quite a lot of talks on structured analytical techniques. And I wanted to take all of that back and apply it immediately within our team. Obviously, that's a really hard thing to do all at once. But what it did lead me to do was sort of sit back and think about how we were approaching analysis and intelligence, what I was doing when I was reviewing other people's reports, and how some of the people I was working with thought. We have a very diverse team, not just government backgrounds like Jason and myself, but also others that come from industry, that come from areas like risk and insurance. But we also have a lot of people that are coming in, and this is their first intel analysis job. So I feel a lot of responsibility to make sure that the people we're working with have a really good grounding in the way they approach intelligence analysis. Everyone has bias. We all want to do good threat intel, but sometimes we can get in our own way. And I think that Charity set this up really well yesterday, talking about how the different ways that we have bias. It comes from the work we do. So some of the work that Jason and I might have done to impact what we think about and the way we think about things. Also, the things we learned when we were studying, the interactions we have with people and the experiences we have, as well as how we feel about it. But it's not just a predisposition to a certain judgment. Our minds are really complex things, and we have to simplify a lot of the thought processes, which can lead to cognitive bias. And that's where you get a bit of a mental error. The upside of this is that traditional intelligence analysts have been grappling with this concept for many years. And as you've heard throughout the talks throughout the last 2 days, there's been a lot of techniques, tools, and models that have been developed to help us manage the bias that we're dealing with on an everyday basis. And that's really what we wanted to apply and make sure that our teams are aware of when they're approaching their intelligence analysis.
Cool. After that, I'm going to talk to you about bias that hit me. So, like I said, I run the technical team now. We get a lot of malware, phishing documents, those kind of things come through our desk. And so, my background has primarily been as a Russia-based analyst, why I'm used to looking at things from that angle and that view of the world. And hopefully some of you might even remember this, but we saw this document come through. It came in through Twitter, it came in through our collection, and a whole bunch of us all jumped up and went, oof, somebody's weaponized the Grizzly Steep document, or the Grizzly Step document, rather. And we all went, oh, must be APT. Turns out, after we'd all had a good look at it and published and spoke about what it was actually doing, just a pen testing organization that had decided to weaponize that document. So our bias kicked in, and I went, ooh, it must be very, very interesting, so therefore it's got to be some form of China, some form of Russia, something like that, something interesting, when in fact it's just another pen tester.
So growing up in Australia, yet another reference to Australia, at my morning tea I used to have a lot of different biscuits and cookies, depending on what you want to call it. And I tried all of them out, and in the end I came to the conclusion that Tim Tams are the best biscuit. They're awesome. So it's 2 layers of biscuit with chocolate in the middle, covered in chocolate. And you can turn it into a Tim Tam slam by biting the tops off the end, and you can drink whatever beverage you would like through it. Typically tea or Milo, sometimes people do it with port. But I moved to the UK about 4 or 5 years ago, and I have an entirely new biscuit range. But the way I'm looking at the biscuit range is through the lens of my original judgment that Tim Tams are the best. So I'm really not moving my judgment very much further. And this is despite the fact that even though there is actually a biscuit on the UK market very similar to Tim Tam, I still think Tim Tams are the best. And this is an example of anchoring. So Sarah set this up yesterday as well, and she did a great job of it. It's really a cognitive bias where we have one piece of information where we're really holding that to that piece of information, and we really move our judgment much beyond that piece of information, and that can really damage our intelligence analysis. It stops us from looking at other things and really assessing them from a fresh perspective. And it's something that we've been really conscious on applying within our own threat intelligence team, and making sure that people sort of step back and really think about what they're looking at and how they're approaching what they're doing. And one of the ways that we've looked at dealing with this is through a traditional intelligence technique called a surge, which Jason is going to introduce you to.
Cool. So this is picked up straight from the CIA library. They've got a really good historical document store where they keep a lot of their kind of analysis techniques. The surge that they're talking about here is generally put into practice when there's a crisis situation. It's basically just throwing as many analysts as you can at an objective or a focus question to answer that. And improve kind of the responsiveness. So one of the other key things it does is the collection part, which we're going to talk a lot about later on. But essentially, yeah, we use them in PwC as a way of grabbing our analysis cohort, putting them into a room, and we've got guys who like to focus on the subcontinent threat actors. We've got folks who like to focus on China-based threat actors, Russia-based threat actors. And basically, we try and bring them all together so that they can challenge each other's perceptions of what is normal for these threat actors. So it's a really good way of grounding them and going through those different analytical techniques.
Well, let's put it into perspective. How do we actually go about doing a surge? Well, the first step is we can't take our entire intelligence team offline, but we need to work out, first of all, what we're going to look at. So we normally identify a particular topic or focus. Sometimes it's been about addressing maybe some of the collection gaps we have. Sometimes it's about looking at a particular threat actor and doing a bit more of a deeper dive. And sometimes we're looking at what kind of attributions out there and do we need to start challenging that. And the latter one is what we focused on in our very last surge of 2018, where we looked at North Korea-based threat actors. There's been quite a lot of activity in that space over the last year, and we really wanted to sort of sit back and challenge the way we looked at it, but also maybe the way security researchers outside of our organization were looking at it, and see what connected and what didn't. So as I said, you can't take your entire team offline as much as you might want to, but what we would normally do is put in different kinds of people with different kinds of backgrounds, and we'd always get people looking at not just the technical side, but also the strategic side. And in the North Korea search that we did, we had a few people that really focused on this a lot, and we made sure they weren't looking at the threat actors that they knew quite a bit about or the malware that they knew quite a bit about. We also found that getting the people in the room is a really key component. And ideally, if you can move them away from where you'd normally sit. I know for example, I struggled dealing with business as usual activities and trying to focus at the same time on the surge. So getting people in the room and away from where you would normally be is a really great way to approach it.
And just quickly as well, getting management out of the room, so people like Rach and I out of there, we have preconceptions, and I think somebody highlighted in a talk earlier the fact that if management's in the room, people are more likely to agree with you. We're not always right. As I proved before, sometimes we are very wrong. So that's another key aspect, and I think that works quite well with surges.
The next step, we're doing a surge for a reason. It's not just about getting more information. We're also wanting to use it as a tool for us to really challenge our bias and our assumptions. So we normally try to work out in advance what we're going to try this time round. So we've tried things like SWOT analysis and tepid oil, ACH, which we've heard quite a lot about throughout the last few days, and diamond models and kill chains. In the last one we did, we tried to do kill chain and diamond model analysis in a few different ways. And we found that for our purposes, it didn't quite work. We didn't have the right kind of information, and it kind of distracted some of our analysts from really getting down into the nitty-gritty of some of the things we were wanting to find out and sticking to the questions that we'd set ourselves at the very beginning. Obviously, the next step, actually do the surge. But you've got to be careful not to go down a rabbit hole. And it's very easy. Once you get into a topic, it's interesting, you want to keep going. And we have a lot of trouble with that sometimes with analysts, where they find something and it's like, it's just too cool, I want to keep going. But actually, if they need to start to work out when to pivot, when to stop. But what we'd normally do is do stand-ups, usually at the end of the day, and get people to stand up and talk about what are they finding and what are they going to do next. And this is where we start to look at the assumptions and bias that the people in the room potentially already have. And it comes through in the way that we talk about what we're finding. And we can start to get people thinking about what they're looking at from a very different perspective, partly because you've got different people asking questions and going, are you sure, and why? For example, in the last surge, there's been a lot of, like I said, there's been a lot of information on North Korea in the last year, and some of the analysis we were observing didn't necessarily match what other security researchers had said. And we started getting ourselves in a little bit of a knot, some of which has led on to further analysis beyond the surge. But it made us sort of think about that from a, is it definitely true just because it's been reported on in the public, if we're finding something different? The last step is, you've done a surge, you actually want to get something out of it. And we've set ourselves questions. We want to find out, did we answer our questions? And if we did, to what extent? But you also want to see, how did the surge in itself work? Did it give us the practice in the techniques? Did it enhance our analysis and our intelligence? And we normally would sit down a week later and get the group together and say what worked and what didn't. I think one of the really interesting things for me in the last one we did is we had a brand new starter that came in, and she was so enthusiastic, and she loves the ACH, wants to apply it for everything. And that kind of passion and enthusiasm is something really key for the work that we do. But one of the other guys had done the ACH, first time for him as well, and he just did not like it. It wasn't his thing. And that's a really useful thing for us to learn about our team. What works well for one person doesn't necessarily work well for another. So really for us, the surge is really just a vessel through which we can employ different techniques and tools to challenge our own bias. For us, it's kind of one of the ways that we untie our anchors, and that's how we go forward in and enhance our own skills and behaviors.
So maybe you're thinking, that sounds really good, but does it actually even work? I thought the same thing when somebody first put me on a surge back in ASD, and it turns out to be a really good idea. So we're going to talk through some of the practical benefits, some of the kind of tangential benefits we get out of this as well. We'll step through some of the actual analysis we did. So we'll go through a SWOT. We'll go through some diamond models we drew up based on some previous campaigns. We'll go through an ACH and talk about how that all looked. And hopefully that will be actually useful, and you can put that in practice when you get out of here. So, and I apologize for the big wall of text here, but essentially we set out ourselves 6 questions. The first one, and we're using some of our names here, so Black Artemis for us is Lazarus, Black Banshee is what the community calls Kimsuki. Is Black Lazarus one group, or is it multiple? You'll see on the right-hand side, there's Lazarus shared code overlaps. Now this is from a tweet that Chris Doman put up, and it kind of covers off where the overlap with those codes are and kind of what their motives are. Within PwC, we focus on motives to group our threat actors. So we go from an espionage focus, a sabotage, hacktivist, or crime. So for us, it's kind of a nice way to group our threat actors. And you can kind of see here that Lazarus has quite a few different aspects and motives to their operations. So I guess the question here is it a different groups, or are they the same? Are they the same team, just with different tasking orders, those kind of things? The next one is is Kimsuki still around? We hadn't actually done any reporting on them in the year preceding the surge, so for us it was like, do we need to go back and look and actually see what we collected? The third question, are there any kind of connections, whether that be targeting, whether that be infrastructure, whether that be capabilities between these groups? And that kind of ties quite nicely into 4 and 5, which is, what are they targeting between the groups? Are they going primarily after espionage? Are they going after crime, sabotage, those kind of things? And then the last question, which I actually should have just left to the presenter before us because he could just answer all of it, and it's an ambitious question for an organization like PwC, but who's behind these? So who actually sits at the computers? Who's the operators behind these? And can we at least get some way to answering that question? Clearly, given the previous talk, we're not anywhere near as close to that as he was, but gave a roaring good crack.
So we mentioned we do a SWOT analysis, and we actually find this is a really good tool to employ in the surges that we do. And part of that's because it's a good way to look at threat actors. So it's usually used in military intelligence, and the strengths and weaknesses are looking at the internal factors, and the opportunities and threats are looking at it from an external mechanism. You can see that some of the ones that we identified in the search we did on Lazarus group is that they tend to update their malware regularly, they adapt to system patches, and they're difficult to track with rules. But they also have an external threat to them where embargoes on North Korea potentially restrict access to resources. So getting the people in the room at the beginning of the week and doing a SWOT, it gets people in the mood for the topic, but it also starts to sort of see who knows little bits about the topic that we're looking into. We can start to recognize the biases at the very beginning, and we get different perspectives. So we start to realize, actually, that person knows more about this than I thought they did. I should make sure that I'm talking to them more when I go forward in what I'm doing. We revisit this at the end of the week and see what's changed. And usually it will have changed in some way, because the point of what we're doing is trying to explore what we know and what we can find, and see if there's anything new.
So for this one, when we were going back over this and looking at it, the first weakness, or lack of funding, given that Lazarus Group does a lot of financial crime and theft of money, you could have an argument to say, well, actually, they're probably not lacking in funding. They've actually got plenty of funds to do. And I guess our bias kicked in when we first did this on the first day, because we're all approaching it from, I spent half my life looking at most of the Russian threat actors, so I go, well, they must be well-funded, but then compare them to a North Korean actor, the North Korean actor must be less funded than those organizations. So I guess for us, being able to do it on the first day and then doing it on the last day, you'll see a lot of these will start to change ever so slightly, and I think that's quite a good example of how the practical benefits for this. So diamond models. I was going to explain it, but we had a really good walkthrough of all of this. So we took every single open source report we could find, and we wrote a diamond model for them. Now, we're lucky in that we're able to do it for the complete picture, and we have the nice all 4 points covered off. So if we go with the first instance of Lazarus reporting, which was 2011 by McAfee, called 10 Days of Rain, it's very much the motive that you get out of this threat actor from this point on is around sabotage. So they're going DDoS, they've got their multi-tiered servers to prevent takedowns of that DDoS infrastructure. They've got the targeting of South Korean operations, so government, military, those ones, and then the US military, but in South Korea. So that there's a clear picture that comes out of here that this is a sabotage operation focusing on South Korea. Now, when we take that to the next step and look at the Bluenoroff activity, which is reported by Kaspersky, this is to the start of their kind of public reporting on their financial crime operations. So the motive here is different. So their targeting is different. We can see that through the victims. We've got the Southeast Asian banks. We've got a strong connection to at the time of this report, a strong connection to the Bank of Bangladeshi heist. But there are some interesting capabilities that kind of overlap. So in the last slide, that was kind of the first reporting. Between that and this report, the Operation Blockbuster by Nevada came out. And they talk about the Kilo Alpha Papa type series of malware. So there's a whole lot of overlap between the financial stuff and the espionage stuff that we covered in the last slide. So you've got, so the backdoors are very similar to the Romeo series, which is what Nevada calls the Lazarus rats. You've got the proxy stuff, which is the proxy alpha, that is covered off. The use of the same RC4 key, so that's kind of that indicator, well, there's definitely code overlap, but the motives is very different. So this AABBCCDD marker, so in this instance, it's used to decrypt exfiltration or exfiltrated data. And I'll just keep that in mind because I'll talk about it in the next slide as well. So you can kind of see that there's, between the two operations, there's been, 5 years of difference, and their motives have changed quite heavily. But there's lots of code overlap. So there's an argument there to be said that they're potentially the same organization, just have different tasking orders this time around. So if we look to a more recent report, and this is one that we've done internally, we were looking at the Manuscrypt malware, which takes advantage of some issues with the Hangul word processor. Hopefully I got that one right. But essentially, you can use it to exploit or gain remote code execution via shellcode. So you've got this AABBCCDD comes up, but instead of being used to decrypt exfiltration, it's used as the marker for the shellcode to then execute. So you've got that same kind of code overlap there as well as what you've had in the other ones. But this time around, it looks like they're kind of switched back to a little bit of their espionage ways because they're going after South Korean technology companies. A little bit of this campaign did also touch on banks and Bitcoin providers. So there's those kind of dual motives again there.
So we talked a little bit over the last few days about analysis of competing hypotheses, or ACH. How many people in the room have actually done an ACH? That's a pretty good mix there. So those of you that have, and for those of you that haven't, an ACH we've found is generally a really good way of analyzing more than one hypothesis. So not focusing on one, but actually trying to focus on a multiple, and not trying to prove it, but actually to refute it. And that can be a really difficult thing to get your mind around. You inevitably, when you start to do it, try to prove it, and then you have to step back and go, wait, hang on, that's not the point of this technique. And part of why we did it in the last surge is we really wanted to get some of our analysts understanding how they can do this with the work that they do going forward. Overall, it was a really interesting experience, and what we did is we got more than just our threat intelligence team to come in the room when we did it. So we had people from our incident response and our threat detection teams come in as well, and they had a really different lens and a different perspective that they brought to the table, to the extent where we added an extra hypothesis at the very last second, which threw a few people off, but we had a lot of really good debate. And the key component that we took away from it is it got people to think about their thinking. And as we've discussed in the last few days, that's a really key part to being a really good threat intelligence analyst. Step back and think about the way you're thinking so that you can address the biases that you know that you probably have.
So outcomes. So how did we actually go? Did we answer our questions? Were we able to remove some of that bias? I think we did pretty well, and we're going to step through some of these. So as we mentioned before, the first question is Black Artemis, aka Lazarus group, one threat actor? So the ACH that I showed you on the screen before suggests that it's actually one group, but potentially with sub-teams that might have different targeting requirements. We still think we probably have a little bit of work to do on this, and we'll continue to look into it. Cool, so is Black Banshee or Kimsuki still active? So when we went back and looked for our collection logs, and this is something I would stress to everybody to do, you should definitely go back in time and look through stuff, because there is a gold mine of stuff that we might have missed. It harkens back to the paleontology reference yesterday. So we actually were collecting quite a lot of their samples. We just hadn't had the resources all the time to look at it. So when we did go back, we found some stuff that we hadn't known about, so we were able to generate some reporting out of this, which is a good outcome.
The third question, are there any other connections between the North Korean groups? Well, likely yes. A SWOT analysis would suggest that there's probably some common tasking, and some of our other observations that we made while we were doing our analysis suggested that there are sort of shared targets and objectives. The fourth question, what are the targeting focuses of each group? As Jason mentioned, we look at it through the lens of motivation, and for those of you that track North Korea threat actors or North Korean threat activity, you wouldn't be surprised to see espionage, crime, and sabotage be the prime motivations that we found.
Cool. From a malware overlap and vulnerabilities being used, we see a lot of overlap in things like Lazarus, so between Bluenoroff and the main Lazarus group. Yeah, we definitely see some overlaps. Kimsuki with the rest of the groups that we identified, not so much. There is some overlaps with groups like Connie and Noki, where we see code similarities with some of their older stuff that they were using. So there is definitely quite a lot of overlap, but they are still able to be broken down into distinct groups of activity. And then lastly, there's probably a rigid hierarchy, and I think we discovered that with lots of the discussion around units. There's some arguments around Unit 121 and how they link into the cyber activities. But at the end of the day, there's not enough information for us to actually go and do that kind of research. When we're looking at Chinese-based threat actors, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can go and look at to do that. So we kind of leave that to the good people in government. All right, so bonus outcomes. This is where we get to go memes before the fun police at PwC tell us off.
So really, doing a surge or any kind of structured analytical technique and applying it what you do, the key component is knowledge sharing. So one of the things we did after the surge, or during the surge even, is we made sure we were updating our own knowledge base. So for us, it's Confluence, but we're also updating various things where we track different pieces of information. It also gave us a chance, though, as I mentioned, to interact with our colleagues from different parts of our team. and sort of share the way that we think and the way we approach different things, which meant that they could see why we might ask the questions we ask, and we could get a feel for what their lens is and make sure that we're thinking about that when we're doing our own analysis.
So we went from having some good collection to having lots of collection. So from what I mean by collection, I mean we have Yarrow rules deployed to VT, those kind of things. Well, we also started to build up a lot of kind of detection rules for our endpoint tools. We use a variety of them on our clients. We were able to go out and start looking at how we might be able to scan for some of this activity over the IPv4 space. Overall, our knowledge of being able to detect North Korean activity has increased. So we've gone from just having a TV reception to having the giant sequence station in the middle of the outback.
Not actually. So at the beginning of the surge, you might think you don't actually know that much, but what you really find out is that you know more than you think you do. And really the increased coverage leads us to have an even better picture. We have an increased knowledge of the way the threat actors target, the different kinds of malware, and in general, just a better idea of how they might operate in the geopolitical landscape. And a lot of that's just a really good thing to understand.
Always like this photo. Kimmy looks so happy here. And then lastly, I guess, we talk about this being the most improved player award, but for us, it's actually a really good opportunity to upskill our staff. And one of the things that we're very keen with is, we've got some younger staff here who haven't been through the intelligence community, who haven't had a structured analytics or training program through that. So being able to get everybody in the room and have them from various different aspects of their career, various different training backgrounds, we can actually upskill those people. So Rach mentioned we've got a new girl's feather. Now she started off in September with us, and so she was the first we dropped her into the surge, and she loves her ACH now, so she's kind of learnt those analytical techniques that she'll be able to do forever. So for us, it's just a good opportunity to kind of make sure that we're countering the bias and also upskilling at the same time.
It's a good place to stop it. Yeah, get off the stage. You're done. No, all right. Yeah.